Hi, everyone. My name is Krystel Miranda. I am presenting my organizational analysis paper of the Orange County Department of Education. So just a quick introduction and background on OCDE. The vision of the organization is that Orange County students will lead the nation in college and career readiness and success. And what that looks like is essentially providing support systems and programs that will allow students to be versed in 21st century skills such as critical thinking, creativity, communication, collaboration, literacy within information, media, and technology. So our purpose is to support the 27 school districts within Orange County, and that is through professional development and student programs. So really supporting educators, whether that be at the administrative level, teachers in the classrooms, or support staff. So really making sure that everyone who is involved in education has the supports needed to make sure that our students have the ability to um, move through, to navigate their system and be able to have an equitable education. So the makeup of the leadership team is our board, and that consists of 5 members who represent the 5 trustee areas of Orange County, as well as the superintendent. So there are 10 departments within OCDE, and those include administrative services, alternative education, business services, educational services, governance, leadership, and community partnerships, IT, legal services, special ed. And they all are led by either an associate superintendent or a chief officer. And you'll see this on this slide. I have the Board of Education on the left, and you'll see Dr. Mijares is also on the executive leadership team as well as the board. So he is that bridge between the two. And then underneath Dr. Mijares on the right-hand side, we have our associate superintendents. And just a fun fact, our board and Dr. Mijares are ensnared a little bit in a legal battle. They've actually been suing each other for about 3 years now. First over the budget, which the board was had cut without, I guess, the appropriate process. And so Dr. Mijares sued, and then there was a decision that he was within his right, and then the board sued him back, and now they are again in another legal battle over who can choose legal counsel. So they just settled, and that cost the taxpayers about $3.2 million. And now OCDE has to pay, I believe, $30,000 in legal fees. So, and then also just for fun, I wanted to show where I kind of land on the totem pole. So you have all the way at the top our superintendent, followed by our associate superintendent. So I actually fall under Christine Olmstead, who is the lead for educational services. After her, we have our executive director and then our director of our unit. Beyond that is the manager of the team that I fall under, which is learning supports. And then I have a coordinator that I have, who's my direct supervisor. And then finally, all the way at the bottom is myself. So I'm a program lead, and I run our restorative practices program, which essentially I teach teachers how to communicate with their students in an equitable way, and then implement restorative practices within their own classrooms. So here we have our illustrative management practices. And I would argue that OCDE actually fluctuates through all 4 of these different models, depending on the situation and what the external environment looks like at the time. So for the most part, there is an emphasis on the human relations model as much as possible. There's that need to maintain a competent, integrated, and dedicated workforce. And the reason for that is that um, with all of the work that we do within the different districts, it's very difficult to have an abruption or a disruption at any point during the year because we do work year round. So there is a high importance set on getting the right people into the positions and then making sure that um, that we have that dedicated workforce at all times. And even though it does seem um, uh, a little forced. We do have the cohesion and morale values that are always in place as far as making sure that everybody feels seen and heard. Within the open systems model, when there's always a need to acquire resources and adapt to uncertain environments, especially because we are funded um, through various ways as far as maybe state funding or grants. Um, those different channels of funding are never guaranteed. We could get our funds pulled at any time. So we need to always be sure that we are adapting to the funds that we have and always making sure that we are applying to grants as much as possible so that we can acquire those resources. The values are flexibility and readiness, which is something that OCDE prides itself in, is always moving with every change and pivoting as needed so that the ends values of growth and resource acquisition are always in place. And then we see that especially now with COVID. As soon as that hit, we had a spotlight on distance learning and providing support and resources for students who were having social emotional reactions to being isolated at home, making sure that everybody had the technology needed so that they could continue to get the education that they deserve. So that open systems model and human relations model, I would say, are at the forefront of OCDE and the focus as far as their values. We also do have a rational goal model, I would say, in place. So there's always a lot of planning, goal setting. However, because of the uncertain environment that we do work within, those don't always pan out. But there is always a focus on goal attainment, especially with our grant funded programs, because we do have contracted units of service, as well as contracted goals that we need to meet and services that we have to provide. So I would argue that within certain programs, that rational goal model is more prevalent. And then finally, the internal process model with the informational management communication. That is almost always kind of in the shadows as far as what information looks like from top to bottom. So there is the values of stability and control have always been there. There's the unwritten rule that you don't speak to anyone who is above your direct supervisor, because there is that need to coordinate and control work activities, especially because the organization is often in the limelight when anything occurs within the county. People are looking directly at OCDE because there is the misconception that OCDE governs the different districts, and that is very far from the case. So every district is actually autonomous. What we do is we just provide support services directly supporting instruction or education programs, the different specialty programs such as special education, and that professional development and student enrichment piece. So that internal process model, even though I wouldn't say it's formal or formally um, at the forefront, it is always kind of in the back as we are doing anything that has to do beyond our scope of work. We always have that level of communication and the processes that we have to follow. So, as far as the 6 mechanisms for coordinating and controlling work activities, I would say that OCDE has mutual adjustment, direct supervision, standardization of work processes, and standardization of values. Um, so, mutual adjustment, consulting with each other informally about what needs to be accomplished and how that happens on a daily basis through email, through now Zoom meetings. And then finally, that responsibility for coordination and control resting with those who do the work. While that is true, it does filter up through the hierarchy. So if I don't do the work, that means that my coordinator, then my manager, and finally, I would say my director is culpable as well, because there is an expectation that that direct supervision is there. So the supervisor is assigned to take responsibility for a group of workers, and then that managerial hierarchy is established to make sure that the efforts of everybody are being controlled as well as accomplished. So the supervisor does have a personal stake in it and does monitor individual performance as much as possible. And the expectation at OCDE is that you do check in with your direct supervisor at least once a week. For me, that looks like a Zoom call meeting, not only with my coordinator, who is my actual direct supervisor, but also with my manager. So I actually have 2 check-ins a week, which is contrary to the idea that you should only be reporting to one person. So standardization of work processes. So work that's programmed in advance to its execution, developing rules, having standard operating procedures. That is all true to the organization as well. So that coordination is built into work processes themselves, and what does ring true is the strict limitation of each worker's discretion. So, as I mentioned before, we do have very specific protocol in place to make sure that we don't go beyond our scope of work, and anything that happens out of the ordinary routine or work duties, you have to go directly to your supervisor and make sure that what you're doing is appropriate, because there are a lot of liabilities working within the Department of Education, as well as a lot of sensitive information that we do handle. So there is processes in place to make sure that we're following best practices. And then finally, standardization of values. So organizational leaders communicate and act upon a clear vision of what the organization exists to do. So we do have those values that guide us, and the coordination and control that's facilitated by the commitment of our organizational members is internalized. So we are always thinking first and foremost about the good of our students and our educators, who ultimately are also thinking about the good of our students. So whatever we do, truly the value is placed on making sure that our students are prepared and receiving the best education possible, and making sure that we're providing whatever support that we can so that that is happening. And that's shown a lot through the work that we do, the programs that we run, as well as the idea or the expectation that whatever role that you are in, you do go above and beyond. So, for example, in my position, I'm a trainer. However, if a teacher asks me to come and do direct service in her classroom and show her or implement restorative practices, then it is my obligation to do so, even though that doesn't fall within my job description anymore. I no longer provide direct service, but if it is requested, then I am expected to comply with that. So moving on to classic organization theory, we'll start with Max Weber. So he has the ideal type bureaucracy, and I do apologize, it did not update this slide under Frederick Taylor and Henry Fayol. But Max Weber and his ideal type bureaucracy has the fixed official duties, so that idea that work is systematically divided, making sure that everybody has clear defined duties and are able to make decisions within their own sphere of competence. So as I mentioned prior, we do all have to stay within our lanes, and it is a very clear message to everybody that your duties are meant to be performed in a certain way, and anything outside of that scope, you are to ask your direct supervisor how to proceed. So the hierarchy of authority is also in place. So the idea that there is someone underneath you and always a supervisor that is higher helps with the accountability. So making sure that there's a clear chain of command. And as you saw in the previous slide, I'm very, very much at the bottom, but there is a very clear chain of command as far as moving up through the organization. Systems of rules, so behavioral rules limit scope of authority and help constrain officials' personal conduct. So there are a lot of rules as far as how decisions are made, how our work is to be performed, and all of that is definitely well documented. So that piece of written documentation, making sure that rules, decisions, and administrative actions do have written records is in place. So technical expertise, where officials are selected and promoted based on their competence to perform specific specialized duties. That is, I would say, a high point of working within the Department of Education. There is a lot of importance placed on making sure that you are continually learning and becoming an expert in your field because the other school districts do look to us as the experts in education and in specialized programs. So for example, restorative practices, I have been highly trained within different curricula, as well as gone to several trainings across the country, just to make sure that my knowledge is at the forefront of restorative practices, because I am a trainer. So people are looking to us for our expertise. And then finally, career service. So making sure that anyone who is working there is there for the long run, and that it's not for personal service. So there are, again, a lot of processes in place to make sure that anything that comes from our office is done in good faith, and making sure that the services are the fringe benefits that we receive are do help a lot of people stay. So our health insurance, for example, is probably the best that you're going to see. And the salary is definitely generous for the type of work that we do, especially when you're thinking in education, which leads to a lot of people staying in their positions for a very long time. So while that is always positive, it does hinder some people when they're starting their career as far as being able to move up the ranks, because there are other people that are there for the long term. Oh, I'm sorry. Back. And again, I do apologize. I did mean to change where it says the quotable quote. As you can tell, this was a set of slides that I needed to change out some things. But for Frederick Taylor and his standardization, scientific management theory, there are a lot of, even though this is more meant for very rote processes, such as like a factory setting, there are some of his philosophies that do that are seen within Orange County Department of Education. So for example, standardization of work, and that time study is actually very interesting for depending on actually the political climate and the amount of money that a lot of managers make. There are times when we are asked to write down everything that we do throughout the day, especially right now that we are working remotely, just to make sure that we aren't wasting time, that that basically that what they're paying us is worth the amount of work that we're putting in. So we do have that in place. And then the wage incentive systems. So unfortunately, though, we aren't allowed to get bonuses because we are a public organization and we do receive state funding. There are incentives to stay within OCDE, and that looks like basically pay bumps every year. So you do see the pay scale. It is public. Anyone can look it up. And it is basically a pay raise that's guaranteed every year, as well as the insurance benefits that we're offered. So when we're looking at Taylor and his philosophies, we see, again, functional foremanship. So he believed that supervisors needed to attend only the aspects of management that, or they needed to attend more than the aspects of management than they were just comfortable with. So he believed that supervisors needed to provide direct and immediate supervision, and that was their only role. And you see that within the role of managers. And so, as I said, I fall under a coordinator, and our coordinator is my direct supervisor. I also have to answer to my manager. And so my manager doesn't actually provide any services. She essentially makes sure that that the coordinator is providing programming, and then myself. So the coordinator is actually providing programming as well as developing programming. And then I, as a program lead, provide that direct service to our educators. So that falls under that functional foremanship. So we do see that very top-down form of organization with Taylor within OCDE. And then finally, Henri Fail and his 14 administrative principles. So there are a lot that are in place within OCDE. So division of work, as we can see, so complex organizations are assigned fixed tasks. So you could see that within our divisions, and then even within our divisions, we have units, and then within our units, we have teams. So there is a lot of division of work, authority and responsibility. So those leaders, and making sure that there's formal and personal authority, which we're always reminded of. There is, I would say, lack of discipline, in that it's just very hard to discipline anyone because of all of the systems that are in place and all of the paperwork that needs to be done, and recording instances. And it actually is very hard to discipline anyone, though it's not unheard of. And then unity of command. So making sure that you receive orders from only one supervisor. In my case, that doesn't happen. I actually have two supervisors, and sometimes I do get um, contradicting orders. But for the most part, within the organization, everybody does just report to one person. Unity of direction. So making sure that we are all moving towards the same objective. Subordination of individual interests to general interests. So making sure that that the interest of the organization goes above the interest of an individual. And that is the case. It's very difficult to get away with anything because there are so many checks and balances that are in place. Remuneration of personnel. So again, there is generous packages which allow people to stay within their career at OCDE. The scalar chain, so that chain of supervisors from highest to lowest, and then the line of communication that falls or that follows that scalar chain is very firmly in place. Order, equity, which is one of the values of OCDE. So making sure that all employees feel that they're being treated with kindness and fairness. Stability of tenure personnel. As I mentioned before a couple of times, there is not a lot of turnover at OCDE. There are people that stay within their positions for years without moving. Because even at the lower levels of management, the compensation is still very generous. And then initiative, so allowing individual initiative, which stimulates motivation. I would say depending on the position that you're in, this might be something that you are able to do, just because there are limits to what everybody's role is based on the funding that they receive. So if you are grant funded as I am, there isn't a lot of initiative that goes on because you're contractually obligated to fulfill certain duties, and the money that is used to pay for your position can't be used to be doing other things within other programs. So we are now in the human relations theory. So Mary Parker Foley believed in a lot, or was able to really introduce that idea of humanization within scientific management and making sure that that human factor was always in place. And something that is very human to us is conflict. So her idea of integration, which is really bringing both sides of a conflict together and finding a solution or a compromise, I believe is at the heart of her philosophies. So when we're dealing with districts, that often happens that we have to come to some sort of an agreement or some sort of a compromise so that districts don't feel that they've been slighted or that they are not receiving the services that they deserve. So one example that I gave was some districts were not receiving as many support services as others. There were some districts that it seemed that they were taking advantage of almost every program that we offered, while others had not even heard of some of the programs. And so early last year, at the beginning of the school year, our superintendent got all of the district superintendents together for a big meeting and essentially gave a presentation of all of the programs that were available. And following that meeting, there was a plan put into place where every single district or every single superintendent and associate superintendent and basically district lead would get a newsletter of every program that we offered throughout the year on a weekly basis. And that's been in place for almost 2 years now. So it falls definitely under Mary Parker Foley's ideas of conflict and resolution. So in practice, we're often responding to things that happen within the realms of our subordinates. We see that there are suggestions that go up the ladder, and um, in her own words, one person shouldn't be giving orders. And that's because of the amount of knowledge that falls at the lower ranks of management. And we see that a lot. So managers, although managers can't delegate power to subordinates, they can and should give subordinates opportunities for developing their own power, which is very much how ideally things work at OCDE. However, that isn't always the case. And again, that's usually due to funding and just personal leadership. So depending on who your leader is, you might or might not have that capacity to grow and stretch and work within different aspects of your job. So Douglas McGregor gave birth to the theory X and theory Y. And I would say that OCDE falls very squarely within theory Y, and that looks like an ideal situation as far as making sure that your employees are there for the right reasons. There is a commitment to the objectives of the job, and that the rewards that are associated with their achievement are in line with the work that you do. So it essentially gives light to the idea that as humans, we want to work, we want to follow our passions, and if given the right conditions, then you don't really have to threaten punishment to your workers, and they will work well. So it's in a nutshell, the idea that a happy worker is a hard worker. And then we have Abraham Maslow, and he was actually I've actually read his work before because it is very ingrained in education. There's a saying that a lot of teachers say, you have to Maslow before you can bloom, and there's Bloom's taxonomy. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs falls before Bloom's taxonomy because we need to make sure that our physiological needs are met before our intellectual needs can be met. So that idea of safety, social needs, esteem, all of that is very well ingrained in the field of education. As far as ensuring that our physiological needs are met, we do have that sense of safety, that sense of security that comes within working for the Department of Ed, thankfully. And that's where some of that comes from, is the idea that whatever we offer to our students, we need to make sure that we offer to ourselves as well, because we need to be safe, and our needs need to be met before we can help others. So Maslow is actually a very welcome philosopher that I encountered during this class. So when we're looking at the systems theory, we turn a lot to Barnard, Chester Barnard, and looking at that cooperative system. So that complex physical, biological, personal, and social component, which are in a specific systematic relationship by reason of the cooperation of two or more persons for at least one definite end. So really looking at how we all work together, have that same goal in mind. There's a lot of needs that come from the organization, especially when we're looking at obtaining resources. And one thing that Barnard noted was that organizations often use a lot more resources than they put out when they're trying to achieve their goals. And that's something that is very definitive of the Orange County Department of Education. So when you're talking about producing some sort of support, whether that's a program or a resource. There is a lot of the resources actually go to staffing first. So that goes to salary, to salary, as well as benefits, and making sure that there is someone to develop the program, which is usually the bulk of the cost. So we're constantly having to renew our resources, and again, always applying for grants, hoping that the state provides enough money to our organization so that we can continue all of the systems that are already in place without having to do a lot of cuts every year. So we also see that with Peter Blau and his quantitative performance records, that when a structural change is introduced, there are a lot of strains. And just coming from the realm of education, when we do have to always pivot as far as what the political climate looks like, what our economic climate looks like. We do have a lot of structural changes, and there is a lot of strain that comes with that, whether that's on our budget or on our different positions. We do get a lot of protesters, depending on what kind of policies are coming down the pipeline in education. So again, we're just constantly pivoting, making sure that we are always providing the best possible equitable supports for education possible. So we do work within an open system. So there are those environmental changes, and making sure that we can renew our materials, our energy, our resources, and continue to grow. So that is always at the forefront of the Orange County Department of Education, is how are we going to grow our programs? How are we going to offer more supports? How can we provide best practices? And just making sure that that within that open system, we are hopefully being characterized by that negative entropy, because we want to make sure that we don't deteriorate, and we are constantly being renewed and receiving that new energy. So we now are at our impact of organization on excellence. And we see with that, again, that piece from Peter Blau. So making sure that we are always changing for the better, making sure that whatever it is that we produce, it does respond to the constant changes that we're facing as an organization, different policy changes and what those look like for us, whether that's programming or organizationally. And I'll give you an example. Our funders for my program in particular, the healthcare agency, are looking to add questions to our already very lengthy pre and post survey that we administer to students, adding questions about sexual identification and sexual preference, which means that we're now going to have to have consent forms that go out before we can do any programming with the students, and administer those pre and post tests. So making sure that we're always putting best practices into place, and adapting. So there does tend to be a lot of conflict, as we saw Mary Follet brings up, and we're really just trying to roll with the punches, I would say. But there is a lot of theories that fall within the Department of Ed, and I would say overall, our best practices fall within that bureaucratic form. So we, I would say, most relate to Weber's theories, just because there is a lot of political involvement, being the Department of Education, and the spotlight that's placed on us with every policy that comes down. and how we are going to implement that, and then advise districts to follow suit as well. So we are always constantly trying to make sure that anything that we do is in response to our environment, to our political climate, as well as our social and economic climate as well. So I hope you enjoyed my presentation. Thank you guys so much. And that's it.